So the next, section in chapter 24 is tissues of flowering plants. So we're going to talk about the different types of tissues that actually make up a plant. So we learned about their organs, and now we're going to talk about their tissues. So something to know about flowering plants is that they have the ability to grow throughout their entire lives, which is different than animal tissue, right? We stop growing and dividing and differentiating at a certain point. So plant tissues have the ability to grow throughout their entire life due to something called meristematic tissue. Meristematic means embryonic, means that it's constantly in the form of very young cells that can grow into whatever they need to grow into. And there's two kinds of meristems found in plants. There's apical meristems, which are found near the tips of stem and roots and are responsible for most of the growth that we see, whether it be up or down. This increase in length when you grow up and down is called primary growth, as opposed to the plants actually getting wider, which is called secondary growth. So primary growth is up and down. Monocots, so remember the type of plants that we talked about in the last video. Monocots have a type of growth called intercalary growth, which is from an intercalary meristem. And these appear in between mature tissues. And so this is responsible for growth of things like grasses. So they can grow more than just from the top, like dicots. Monocots can grow from lots of places inside their bodies, which is why grasses can continue to grow even when the tops of them are bitten off. So if you were to bite off the top of a dicot, it would have no more upward growth because you would have removed the apical meristem. But on grasses, since there's several meristems, they can continue primary growth even if you cut off the top of the plant. And then there's three main types of tissues, which we're going to talk about. Epidermal, which is everything on the outside of the plant. So just like your skin is your epidermis, the epidermal tissue is the plant's epidermis. Then the second one is ground tissue. So you can kind of think of ground tissue as the majority of the plant. This is what's doing the plant's jobs. We don't really have something very similar in animals, but ground tissue is where photosynthesis is happening and the plant is just being a plant. And then lastly, we have vascular tissue, which moves water and nutrients throughout the plant. So this would be like your cardiac system and your respiratory system inside of your body. So the first one we're going to talk about is epidermal tissue. So epidermal tissue is a bunch of very tightly packed cells because its job really is to protect the plant from water loss. That's one of the biggest jobs. And another modification for this is that it's covered with a waxy cuticle that helps prevent water loss. So this is a tough, waxy, thick, impermeable substance that the epidermal cells secrete. That way, water doesn't evaporate through these cells. It also helps protect against bacteria and other organisms that may cause disease. And some epidermal cells, mostly in the roots, have long, thin growths called root hairs. And if you remember to the last section, we talked about how these root hairs can really provide additional help for absorbing water because they increase the surface area of root cells by so much, so they can absorb so much water. And then there's another couple types of special or epidermal cells on stems, leaves, and reproductive organs, so most of the shoots portion of the plant. The epidermal cells produce hairs called trichomes. And these trichomes serve a couple purposes because they protect the plant from getting too much sun. I should say too much sun, not too much such. They protect the plant from getting too much sun and help conserve moisture. But some of these trichomes are actually an adaptation for defense. They produce toxins to fend off herbivores. There's another very special kind of epidermal cells called guard cells. And these guard cells are what regulate stomata. So you guys have hopefully heard of stomata, and what they are the openings that are usually found on the undersides of leaves. So they are found on the undersides of leaves of dicots, and they're found on both sides of monocots. And what they are openings that allow for gas exchange. So this would be an opening that would allow carbon dioxide in and oxygen out. Now, they are regulated by these two cells on the other side called guard cells. So when guard cells want to open the stomata, the plant pumps water inside of them. Then the guard cells kind of puff up and they bend. And when they bend, because they're filled with water, they make this opening, and the stomata is open. Stoma is singular. Stomata is open. Then, when they want to close the stoma because they're losing too much carbon dioxide or losing too much, it's nighttime, so they don't need to photosynthesize, or they're losing too much water, the guard cells release water. They become flaccid. They're not puffed up anymore, and the opening closes, and now the stomata is closed. So that's how guard cells work, and they're a special kind of epidermal cell. And lastly, there's something called periderm, which you need to know about, and it's kind of the older outside tough portion of plants. And so in the older woody plants, so these are plants that are brownish, have tough woody outsides, they're not green young plants, the epidermis is replaced by something called periderm. So here's a green young plant. You can see there's just epidermis. However, as you move down further in the plant, you can see that it becomes tough and woody, and now the epidermis is replaced by something called periderm. Periderm consists of cork, which is the outside, and cork cambium. So cambium is meristematic tissue, and what it does is it makes new cork. The mature cork cells become larger and waterproof, and so that's what you see here. It eventually becomes the bark. Okay? And they help to protect the plant and provide support. So there's the periderm. It consists of the cork and the cork cambium. So in a very young cell, it isn't there, it's just the epidermis. In an older plant, we see the cork and the cork cambium, and in an even older plant, the layers of the periderm become thicker and thicker. The second type of tissue is ground tissue, and your textbook actually says just fills the interior of the plant. And that kind of takes away from the importance of ground tissue. It's actually very, very important. This is where the plant is doing all of its life jobs. So it's the majority of plant tissue, and it consists of different types of cells, which are called parenchyma, collenchyma, and sclerenchyma. They are very funny sounding, but they all serve 3 different jobs. So the first are parenchyma cells, and parenchyma cells are pictured right here. This is the image from your textbook. It's on page 449. And they are the most abundant, and they are most like a typical plant cell that you've ever learned about. They have one cell wall. They're very soft and flexible. They're not very specialized. They're found in all organs of the plant. They may contain chloroplasts if they are performing photosynthesis, or a special kind of structure called plastids if they're storing sugars that were made in photosynthesis. And they can divide to make new and more specialized cells. So, for example, they can divide, like in a root, if you cut off the bottom of a plant to put it in a vase, when you cut it, the parenchyma cells would divide and start forming new roots. So those are parenchyma cells. Then we get to collenchyma cells, which are pictured in the middle right here. Collenchyma cells are very similar to parenchyma cells, except they have thicker primary cell walls. So they also, collenchyma cells too, only have one cell wall, but it just becomes much thicker. So here you can see the parenchyma cells, the cell wall is very thin. It's just that dark circle right there. Over here, all of this dark tissue is cell walls. And so it becomes much thicker in the corners. So see right here, it's very thin, but over here it's much thicker. And it's very uneven, but it becomes much thicker. And this starts to give flexible support to the growing parts of a plant body. So this is what allows the growing plant, it's still green at this point because it still has epidermis rather than periderm, but it starts to give support. So this thickness right here is not living cells, it's just tougher tissue that allows for the plant to stand up straight. Then finally we have sclerenchyma cells, and these actually have a second cell wall, which is called their secondary cell wall. And this secondary cell wall, it's actually found found surrounding the primary cell wall, and it's thickened with a chemical called lignin, which is very tough. And this allows for the sclerenchyma cells to provide a lot of support to the mature parts of the plant. This is how plants stand up. This is kind of like the bones of the plant, are the sclerenchyma cells. And the odd thing is that most sclerenchyma cells are non-living. So they will grow to maturity and then die and lose all their cytoplasm and all of their insides. But the cell walls remain. So all of this is cell wall that was grown and thickened with lignin, and the inside of the plant dies. and most of them are found in vascular tissue. So let's move on to vascular tissue. So vascular tissue functions in transport. This is what moves water from the soil where plants absorb it to every other part of the plant, all the way up to the tips. So it brings water from roots to shoots. And this is also what brings sugars, the products of photosynthesis, from shoots to roots or to other parts in the plants where they need it. And there's two kinds. There's xylem, which moves water, and phloem, which moves sugars. And we call these tissues complex tissues because they're made of two or more types of cells. So there's several types of phloem, several types of xylem. So let's talk about xylem first. So there's two types, like I said, they're called tracheids and vessel elements. Both tracheids and vessel elements are non-living and hollow, and vessel elements are larger, have perforated plates in their end walls, so they are actually dead. So they're functionally dead at maturity. They grow up, and then they, like I said, they lose all of their cytoplasm and organelles. They become dead. These are sclerenchyma cells. So they're very tough around the outside. So they provide support, and they help move water. So this is one cell right here. This is another cell right here. But the entire purpose is moving water, so there needs to be a way for water to move through. So they basically provide a continuous channel because water moves through these perforation plates right here. So this is a vessel element. This is a vessel element, but they're connected by perforation plates so water can move through. Then our tracheids are a little bit different. They're shaped less evenly, and they have tapered ends. So they're not flat at the end. See here how the vessel elements are flat? Tracheids are kind of fit together oddly. But they still help move water because they have these pits in their cell walls that water can move through. And there are also some parenchyma cells in the middle of the xylem that provide storage for the cells. Because remember, these sclerenchyma cells that are the vessel elements in the tracheids, they're dead. So they're not storing anything. But the parenchyma cells that are used can provide storage. Then the second type of vascular tissue is what we called phloem. And phloem is used to move sugars that the plant makes. So this is moving sugars actually from the ends of the plants down to the rest of the plant into the roots for the main type of storage. But this again contains two types of cells. There are sieve tube members and companion cells. So sieve tube members are alive. This is different than xylem. Phloem cells are alive. Sieve tube members are connected to form a continuous tube. So here's a sieve tube member, and they are connected to form tubes, and there's these little things in the middle called sieve plates that connect them. And these sieve tube members are very unique because they have a cytoplasm but no nuclei at all. So they are still alive, but they don't have a nucleus. And the way that this functions is because they are connected to these things called companion cells. So here would be a companion cell for the sieve tube member. So if here's a sieve tube member, here's a companion cell. And these companion cells do contain nuclei. And they are connected to the sieve tube members by tiny holes in the cell wall called plasmodesmata. So plasmodesmata connects the cytoplasm of two different plant cells. And that's what connects the sieve tube members with the companion cells. What this allows for is for the sieve tube member to be functionally empty so that it can move more sugars without the organelles getting in the way. But it still needs to be regulated. It still needs proteins made for it, etc., etc. So it needs a nucleus that's accompanied by the companion cell. And that's the end. Those are the three types of tissues.